There are two overwhelming dangers. If we don't deal with them, nothing else is going to matter. One is the growing threat of nuclear war, both in Europe and in Asia. Another is the looming crisis of environmental destruction, which is getting very close. Right where you are, it's going to be extremely serious. The Iraqi region, the Middle East region in general, is actually heating much faster than the rest of the world, and soon may become unlivable unless significant measures are taken to mitigate and then reverse the crisis. We have maybe a couple of decades in which it's possible to do this. If the opportunity is lost, we will pass irreversible tipping points, and it's just then waiting for catastrophe to come. Those are overwhelming problems. There are many others. Unfortunately, very limited. There are international negotiations, there are regular meetings, the so-called COP meetings. There's another one, COP28, coming up in the United Arab Emirates pretty soon. None of them have achieved anything, mostly rhetoric. This core of the issue must be US-China cooperation. Those are the two world major powers. Unless they cooperate and accommodate on this issue, chances are very slight that it'll be possible to deal with it. And unfortunately, that's not happening. China happens to be far in the lead in dealing with, in moving towards renewable energy. It's way ahead of the rest of the world in electrification. Last year, China put up more solar panels than the whole record worldwide up until that point. The US analysts indicate that they think that China will maybe to able to meet its stated goals, blocking in moving to net zero emissions within stated time, a few decades. Unfortunately, in some of the more advanced areas like battery development, China's apparently far ahead. Well, the United States is officially committed to preventing Chinese development. Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo recently said that we must enlist Europe in our campaign to prevent Chinese innovation. I'm virtually quoting here. If that continues, the chances of China and the United States working together on this issue are very slight, and that could be a disaster for everyone. There are many other cases. Let's take Brazil. The Amazon rainforest, it plays a crucial role in the international ecology. It's sometimes called the lungs of the earth. Produces a huge amount of oxygen. It's a carbon sink. It's been a self-sustaining system. The rains that it produces keep the forest going. The indigenous populations have been living there in harmony with nature for as far back as we can trace it. But in the last years, the far-right administration, the Bolsonaro administration, accelerated pretty sharply the destruction of the Amazon for the benefit of agribusiness. How is that? Is that any better? Okay, good. Well, I was going to say that the administration in Brazil, well, the war in Ukraine has been, the Russian invasion was, of course, criminal aggressions, no justification for it, plenty of provocation, but no justification. The war has turned into a kind of a proxy war. Many describe it that way. Proxy war between Russia and the United States with Ukrainian bodies. If there is no negotiated settlement, the war will very likely continue. It may escalate. If Russia's potentially facing defeat, which doesn't look likely, but it might happen, it will almost certainly escalate to use of heavier conventional weapons against Kiev and Western Ukraine, attacking NATO supply lines, one of a number of scenarios one can imagine in which NATO and Russia would come into conflict that could quickly move up the escalation ladder to a nuclear war, which would in effect be terminal. Can't have a major war between two nuclear powers. That's a possibility if the war does not move towards a negotiated settlement. It's possible. And there are other dangers as well. A good deal of the world is suffering from the decline in food and fertilizer exports from the Black Sea region. Many are facing starvation. The limited global efforts, much too limited efforts to deal with the climate crisis have been reversed by the Russian invasion and the reaction to it. Now, huge new fields are being opened for exploration and development. That's a disaster for the world. Unless there's a pretty quick negotiated settlement of some kind, the prospects are very grim, of course, for Ukraine, which will be increasingly devastated, but for the entire world. In fact, about the only countries that are gaining from this war are the United States and China. Europe is declining, maybe moving to deindustrialization. The rest of the world is suffering. China and the United States happen to be benefiting from the war. The United States, like other great powers, has no concern for democracy or humanity. That's not the way great powers operate. They pursue their own interests, which happen to be overwhelmingly the interests of the most powerful groups internal to the country. This goes back as far as we can trace history. We can quote Adam Smith at the origins of modern industrial capitalism and European imperialism. He pointed out that what he called the masters of mankind, the people who own the economy, are the principal architects of government policy, and they use it to advance their own interests, however grievous the effects on the people of their own countries, and particularly the victims of what he called the savage injustice of the Europeans. in their expansionist efforts early stage at the time. It's concerned mostly with the British in India, but it extends. The Middle East knows plenty about this. Take Iraq. Iraq was not created out of interests of the people who live in Iraq. In fact, their interests were of no concern whatsoever when Britain and France, after World War I, divided up the Middle East. Britain established the borders of Iraq so that the oil fields of the north would fall within British rather than Turkish control. Britain established the Principality of Kuwait so that Iraq would not have free access to the sea and would be under British control. The interests of the people were of no concern. In fact, Britain immediately started bombing Iraq to try to put down rebellions against British rule in the early 1920s, and so it continued. The United States was different. The Middle Eastern people have limited options, but real ones. So within Iraq, the country has suffered from a brutal, harsh history. No need to run through it. Now, the internal groups internal to Iraq are failing to come together to reach some kind of settlement among them, which will allow Iraq to confront its very severe problems. And they are severe. Iraq happens to be one of the countries most harmfully affected by the destruction of the climate. If Iraq doesn't do something to deal with this problem in the next few decades, Iraq will be unlivable. And the fighting conflicts among the various factions within Iraq are preventing the government from taking the steps that must be taken to deal with this crisis. There are first thing they must do is overcome their internal divisions. They have to work together. Kurds face extremely difficult problems. They're separated into many countries, most of them in Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Syria. Wherever they are, they face severe persecution. That makes the situation extremely harsh and difficult. It cannot be faced at all unless they first unify, overcome the internal divisions which prevent them from having a unified approach to these massive problems. They differ in different countries. Problems of Kurds in Iraq are different from those of the large majority of Kurds in Turkey under severe repression again. Rojava in Syria faces its own special problems. Iran also harsh repression in the Kurdish areas. Each one is different. The Kurds must unify somehow to try to find ways of fending off these repressions and finding some base for a free and independent Kurdish community. There are bits and pieces of it. Kurds in northern Iraq have a degree of independence. Rojava has succeeded astonishingly in horrendous conditions in Syria. It's now under severe attack by Turkey on one hand, hostile Assad government on the other. It's in an extremely difficult position. Kurds in Iran are probably the most exposed to the current repression in Iran, probably more than any other group. So these are extremely difficult problems. The only way to begin to confront them will be to overcome the internal divisions that severely weaken the very hard, harsh Kurdish struggle for freedom, which has been going on for a century. You know better than I do the Kurdish slogan that the Kurds have no friends but the mountains. To rely on the United States is suicidal. The United States has a brutal record of supporting bitter repression of the Kurds. Right now in Syria, the Trump administration pulled out small deterrent forces that were preventing a harsher Turkish attack. They didn't care. There was enough public protest, so they left a few. In Turkey, in the 1990s, it was extremely severe repression of Kurds. Tens of thousands were killed. Thousands of towns and villages were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of refugees driven into miserable slums in Istanbul. I visited some of them. The United States was providing 80% of the weapons. As the atrocities increased, the flow of US weapons increased. Counting on the United States doesn't make any sense. You can use the temporary support of the United States for advantage of the Kurds, but having any faith that that's a base of support is completely belied by history and by common sense. Yes, use whatever opportunities there are, but with no illusions. Thank you very much. Thank you.